Welcome to Balkans Debrief. I'm Ilva Tare, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center, and today we turn to a convulsing Serbia, where more than 9 months of peaceful student-led marches have erupted into the most violent political confrontations the country has seen in more than a decade. Tear gas clouds Belgrade streets, gunfire in Novi Sad, and dozens have been injured or detained. At the heart is what foreign observers call the worst crisis for Aleksandar Vučić presidency, while the student protesters call it a fight for survival. I'm delighted to have as my guest today Professor Florian Bieber of the Balkans in Euro Policy Advisory Group BiEPAG, one of the sharpest observers of Serbian politics and the wider Balkans region. Florian, thank you for joining Balkans Debrief.
Thank you for having me on the program, Ilva.
Florian, bullhorns and batons replaced calm as anti-government protests escalated in the past 48 hours or so, as supporters of President Vučić clashed with the demonstrators. What just changed in these demonstrations that turned them so volatile? What prompted the clashes? And my question is, what is driving this escalation? Has the government's strategy shifted in a way that risks spiraling out of control?
Well, I think there's been a shift which has been going on for the last month or so. After the largest big protest on the 28th of June, the students kind of said, we have to take a different strategy, which is more confrontational, which remains peaceful, but which is in a certain way more, peaceful civil disobedience. There were barricades put up in cities across Serbia, and that triggered a more repressive response by the Serbian government. More people were arrested, and also the government has gone on a more confrontational line. Aleksandar Vučić recently pardoned, for example, one of the drivers who drove into the students' crowds months ago. So the signal was confrontation from the government side, and that has kind of led to this polarization. And then we've seen this violence, which mostly seems to have occurred when supporters of the ruling party used violence against protesters, and the police did not intervene. And that has kind of led to an escalation, including the ransacking of several party offices in Novi Sad and other places, and then the police intervention against the demonstrators. So we're seeing really a violence which is on one side triggered by the students and the protesters taking a more robust approach, and the government taking a more repressive line.
Interior Minister Vucic says that this is about restoring law and order, but protesters accuse the state of manufacturing chaos and pushing the country towards a civil war. How much truth is there in those fears? And is there still any space for meaningful dialogue before this crosses a dangerous line?
I think the time for meaningful dialogue has been gone for a long time. I mean, the government has been denigrating the protesters, calling them foreign agents, accusing them of being paid for by neighboring Croatia. And so the willingness of the government to engage any meaningful dialogue has long passed. The students have also upped their demands. Initially, they were just asking for an investigation into the tragedy of last November in Novi Sad, but they've since demanded new elections. And all of that has meant that basically there's no more space for a resolution. Really, we've seen the government unwilling to back down, seeing itself as a fight for their political survival. And I think this violence is a strategy. The government has been trying to induce violence as a way to justify police intervention. And this is what seems to have been going on now. This is not the first time. When we had big protests in March, they created a camp of supporters of the government where the protests were held, again, clearly in the hope of triggering violence. It was only due to the very disciplined organizers of the peaceful demonstrations that there was no escalation. I think this is what the government is hoping for, that the police can crack down, because they're seeing the protests are not fizzling out despite the summer, which everybody was worried about, including myself, that this would be the end to the protests when people go on holidays. There's no university anyhow, so the kind of energy would dissipate, but we're not seeing that. And I think the government is getting to be very nervous that their waiting game is not really working in their favor.
Florian, you have said earlier this year that the clarity and discipline of the students' demands surpasses even the protests that brought down Slobodan Milošević. In the light of the recent violence, can the moral focus of the student-led protests survive, or is there a risk of the movement that will crack down or fracture under pressure, as you said?
I mean, there have been cracks in recent months. There's also been an issue that the last big protest on the 28th of June had very nationalist undercurrents, which I think was not universally supported by all students. So there have been cracks in recent weeks and months. In a certain way, the violence of the government has helped to regain a focus and energy of these protests. Now, of course, it's a very thin line between civil disobedience and violence against the government. And I think this is really a question of the more violence occurs, people might be, if they don't see that the primary source of violence is the government and the government supporters, then people might be alienated from the protest. And this is really a crunch time to see whether the protests remain peaceful, but also forceful. This kind of fine line is one very difficult to find, and I'm not sure whether they will succeed. It's very clear that elections are unlikely to happen as long as the government believes it might lose them. So in a certain way, the streets are the place where the power struggle in Serbia is going to be decided. And I think everybody is very much aware of that.
Is that dangerous?
Yes, it is, of course, dangerous. But at the same time, I would say, when people talk about civil war, I think that's maybe the wrong language, because I think, the supporters of the government are not ideologically committed to the government. You have a lot of people who are, you see a lot of these people on the streets, they're basically the hooligan types. They are young men usually who are clearly paid for or part of the system. So a lot of these people are going to be loyal to the system until they believe it's no longer benefiting them, or they're not ideologically committed. So we see this with authoritarian regimes. They can crumble very quickly if their supporters abandon them because they don't believe that they will provide them benefit. It is, after all, a deeply corrupt and a deeply patronage-based system. So it's not that the 700,000 party members are there because they love President Vucic or his ideas, but because they're locked in patronage. And if that system is crumbling, it probably will crumble very quickly.
On that note, the Financial Times last night article underscored that this is the most severe political crisis for Aleksandar Vucic's tenure. Do you agree with that? And what exactly means this moment more existential for him than previous challenges? Is this more existential?
Absolutely. I mean, he's not had any challenges of any serious nature since he's come to power in 2012. He's only had successes in the sense that elections went in his favor, of course, with some level of manipulation and media control. He's had, of course, nearly a decade of protests against him. The first ones, really serious ones, began in 2016. But none of them were a threat to him. He was able to maintain them, to contain them, to diffuse them, wait them out. So he was quite skillful, but he's done a lot of missteps in the last 9 months. I think he could have diffused the protests very early on, but he failed to do so. And he kind of lost touch in a certain way with the public mood, which really turned against him. And so he might survive it, but I think he's damaged. He's severely damaged in his support afterwards, and I don't think he can fully recover, even if he is able to sit out the current protests. I think he has a very hard time because, again, a large number of citizens have supported these protests. It carried these ideas to the smallest towns where his supporters usually live. So all of that is something which he might survive in the short term, but I think his peak is certainly past him.
The EU has urged calm and respect for free expression, but demonstrators are frustrated by this diplomatic restraint language. Can the EU do more to back democracy in Serbia? You have urged earlier that the EU need to move beyond its obsession with stability and actively worked to restore democracy in Serbia. In this new climate of violence and crackdowns, what leverage does Brussels still have, and is it willing to use it?
I mean, it certainly has leverage. I mean, EU remains the most important economic partner. It's an important source of legitimacy. The Serbian president does rely on diplomatic support, or at least using it. So we had just recently the visit, for example, of the Austrian chancellor to him, where, all this he uses to say, well, he's pro-Western, he's EU oriented, even though it's really a charade. So the EU could use this leverage. It took really 6 months before EU Enlargement Commissioner Kos made a statement clearly in support of the student protests and identifying that their demands are in line very much with the EU accession agenda for Serbia. So the EU has made its position clear, but again, statements are not enough. It could do more. Whether or not Serbia would accept it is doubtful, but even that would help to identify that Vucic is not a pro-European politician. He's not committed to democracy. So, for example, in 2015-16, the EU sent a rule of law mission to back then North Macedonia when there were protests against Prime Minister Gruevski for abuse of office. And that rule of law mission identified the weaknesses which were the foundations of this authoritarian regime. The EU has the authority to send such a mission to Serbia. Serbia might reject it, but again, that would help to identify how Serbia and the current government are really not willing to do what it takes to obey the rule of law.
What's the way out of this? President Vucic says the country is facing a color revolution. The machinery of Western countries want to break, he says, the backbone of Serbia. And he has hinted to possible elections, early elections, while he met, as you mentioned, the Austrian chancellor. In your view, was that a genuine attempt to ease tensions or a calculated move to diffuse and divide the protest movement?
I mean, I think it's mostly for external messaging because, in a certain way, he's been, first of all, he also said during the press conference with the Austrian chancellor, he's not a dictator, he will not run again for another term. But again, we know very well how autocrats circumvent term limits through multiple strategies, including, for example, shifting office. Milo Djukanovic in Montenegro did that. He was president, prime minister, party president, and then again president. So Vucic can take any other office after his term expires. And also, he's been calling early elections every single time since he came to power, except 2020. But he can pick the timing. So I think he will only pick a timing which guarantees best chances for him to survive politically. He's made no signal that he's willing to actually anticipate and engage with the demands of the protesters. So from that point of view, he still calls the shots institutionally, and he's certainly shown no willingness to surrender this authority he enjoys.
In your view, if elections were to happen early, do the students and the broader movement have the capacities or the logistics to actually face the ballot box effectively? Do they have they built necessary infrastructure to go to the vote and actually get a good result? What do you think?
I think there are good chances. I mean, they've been preparing also a list of candidates, and that they would run basically as one list, which would hopefully get support from the opposition. The opposition wouldn't run itself. So the idea really that there's only kind of one very clear alternative to the regime parties. I think it depends all on the momentum. If the movement is seen as fizzling out or delegitimized, then of course Vucic might be able to get one more victory for himself. He's been able to manipulate elections in multiple ways, shipping in voters strategically from neighboring countries who are Serbian citizens. So all of that might work. But it really depends on the timing. If the timing is right, there's a good chance the students and their list might win. The risk, of course, is that they have to come up with a list of candidates, 250 candidates. And the risk, of course, there is we have a very vicious pro-Serb, pro-Vucic tabloid media and TV channels, and they will find any dirt on any of them and will try to discredit them. And this is, I think, what I would expect to see, that you'll see a smear campaign against people, and people will have done some things which might make them bribable or might make them look bad. And that, of course, is, I think, the biggest risk in this moment of between the elections announced and the elections being held, that the government will do everything to discredit the alternative, and that they probably will have some successes. Whether it's enough depends on the timing.
Florian, do you expect any escalation when it comes to ethnic conflicts? Last night in Novi Sad at the SNS party offices, there were some anti-Albanian words sprayed at the destroyed offices of the SNS that were unguarded last night. Do you see any potential escalation when it comes to Albanian-Serbian conflict there?
I wouldn't think so. I mean, it is true, as you noted, that unfortunately some of the protesters have been using these anti-Albanian slurs also to describe Vucic as
Albanian.
Albanian in a derogatory language in Serbian, and that is something which is part of the kind of nationalist larger sentiment in Serbia, which is both on the government and the student side visible. I think it's been the student protests have made some very strong gestures in trying to reach out to minorities in Serbia, in Novi Sad, for example, to the Bosniak community, but also in Vojvodina to Hungarians and others, to really try to bring everybody on board. Albanians remain, I would say, and Kosovo is, of course, a big blind spot for everybody in Serbia, but I don't think that's a risk for ethnic tensions. I mean, the biggest risk, if anything, is that the government tries to instigate some kind of incidents in North Kosovo, which would be a pretext to, kind of distract from the protest. This is, I think, the biggest risk because, of course, they have the means of creating instability in the north of Kosovo, as we've seen with the Banjica incident 2 years ago, and we could see a repeat of that. From the past experience in other neighboring countries, in Macedonia, in Montenegro, these strategies have usually not worked because they're very transparent. I mean, people know that if something happens in Mitrovica or northern Kosovo, that the government in Serbia is probably behind it. I don't think you're going to have a rallying behind the flag effect.
And Florian, while most eyes, as you said, are on Brussels, what they will do now, and probably even DC, Moscow and Beijing have steadily increased their influence in Serbia, economically, militarily, and through media narratives, indeed. How do these external relationships shape Vucic's confidence in existing domestic and EU pressure? And also, could they be embodying his response to the protests? Is there a risk for a looming conflict, not just in Serbia, but as we mentioned, wider in the Balkans, considering also what is boiling in Bosnia too?
I mean, it certainly has the backing of China. I mean, Russia, I think, yes, but it's a less important actor economically, and it's, of course, leverage is limited. But China is very important for Vucic. It's been a major investor in recent years, and certainly one which has been, sort of supporting Vucic also in his more repressive approach. I don't think he wants to, bet everything on China. He's been, very eager to have as many partners as possible. But if he might be cornered or isolated, he might try to do that. Whether he has a lot of leverage is limited, especially as I think many citizens in Serbia, might not have a bad image of China, but certainly don't see it as the main source of external support, partner, and so on. So I think he's trying to keep these doors open. He's using those relations, of course, also to leverage the EU to say, well, if you don't support me, I'm going to turn to China. He used this clearly in the context of the lithium mine project. And so, in a certain way, as long as the EU buys into that, China and Russia are useful for him more as a leverage towards the West.
And Florian, if I were to ask you, how do you see the protests evolving? What will happen in the next days? Do you see an escalation of the situation, or probably things will calm down?
I mean, it's really hard to predict. I mean, I would expect that once violence has become part of the equation, we've seen several nights of violence now, that it's unlikely to calm down because, I think the government wants to see some violence and repression, and then protesters, I don't think, will back down from that. So I fear that we're going to see more violence on the streets of Serbia in the coming days. This would be my biggest worry, but in a certain way also something which seemed inevitable in a certain way, as long as the government was unwilling to really react to any of the demands from the protesters, and this already for 9 months.
Florian Bieber, thank you very much for sharing your valuable insights with our audience.